Welcome, happy Monday, happy Eclipse Day. I hope you've all been having really wonderful days so far. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1040th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and today I have the huge pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring Raven Chacon, Alison Coplan, and Rial Christian. And now I'll introduce our guests and host for today. Raven Chacon is a composer, performer, and installation artist born at Fort Defiance, Navajo Nation. A recording artist over the span of 22 years, Chacon has appeared on over 80 releases on national and international labels. He has exhibited, performed, or had works performed at LACMA, the Whitney Biennial, Site Santa Fe, and more. As an educator, Chacon is the senior composer mentor for the Native American Composer Apprentice project. In 2022, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in music for his composition, Voiceless Mass, and in 2023, he was awarded the MacArthur Fellowship. Alison Coplan is the chief curator at the Swiss Institute, where she organizes exhibitions and programs and oversees publications. In addition to the many exhibitions she's curated, she has organized over 150 public programs with a variety of artists and thinkers. She holds an MA in art history, critical and curatorial studies from Columbia University. And our host today, Rial Christian, is a writer, editor, and art historian based in Queens. Her work explores issues related to identity, diasporas, ecology, media, and materiality. Her essays, interviews, and criticism have appeared in Bomb, Brooklyn Rail, and Art Papers, where she is a contributing editor. She has written texts for numerous catalogs and anthologies, most recently Track Changes, a handbook for art criticism. Christian is the assistant director of editorial initiatives at the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School, and she received her MA in art history from Hunter College. Rial, Alison, and Raven, thank you so much for being here. And Rial, I'll pass it over to you to get us started without further ado.
Thank you, Eleanor. And thank you, Raven and Alison, for joining me in conversation. I'm thrilled to get to talk to both of you about this amazing show that Raven currently has on view at Swiss Institute. So maybe just to begin somewhat broadly, I'd love to hear you two introduce the exhibition, sort of walk us through these slides for those who haven't seen it. Yeah, that seems like a good place to start.
Yeah, maybe a good place to begin talking about the exhibition is with its title, which is a worm's eye view from a bird's beak. Raven, do you want to share where the inspiration for that title came from, how it kind of manifests through some of the works in the show?
Yeah. Thank you all for having Alison and I today to kind of plug the last week of the show. It's been good to have this up for the past couple months, and we've had performances the whole time as well, especially towards the end. We just had one yesterday, and we have one more left at the closing. And that, hopefully, weather permitting, will be on the rooftop terrace. So that's part of the reason that the title came to be. One of the reasons, aside from the obvious art references of perspective, there was, the invitation from both Nord-Norsk Kunstmuseum and Swiss Institute. I was wanting to think about presenting work on on different floors, so very vertically, which is something I'd never really done as a solo artist. Had an opportunity to show work, that much work on multiple levels, floors, right? And so that there was part of that in it too, and visiting SI and seeing the rooftop, knowing that there was going to be performances involved in some way on those multiple levels. I have this score that we performed last month as one of the programs for screaming out of every window in a tall building. And it's supposed to be a family that performs this action or this score. And so that's one of the works in the show. There's other pieces as well that talk about creation stories, emergence stories. So for myself, thinking about Dene stories, Navajo creation stories of coming up through the ground, through multiple levels of the earth at different times, and learning something in these worlds and then being able to ascend into the next world. So now we're at the very top of the fifth world, and maybe we end up in another world above us. And the extension part of this show, the part 2 that's at Nord-Norsk Kunstmuseum, gave me an opportunity to go to Sami territory of Norway, Sápmi, and visit with friends and artists who live up there, who work up there, who steward that land. And one of the friends that I was able to meet with while I was up there is a Sami artist, attorney, yoiker, musician, singer, activist, Andy Sambi. And so he and I were hanging out one afternoon, and I was talking about these stories of emergence, and both how those are stories that are a part of us, Indigenous people. A lot of Indigenous people have these stories in different all around the world, but also how they might function as allegory, as we evolve as people, as we learn from animals. And so he shared with me this really beautiful idea that he calls vertical neighbors. So thinking about those relations that we have outside of time with, worms in the ground and birds in the sky, and thinking about that as a cycle that we are involved in. Not just those animals, but also our ancestors, whether those ancestors are literally buried in the ground, or they are the ones who came before us in those lower worlds, or those ancestors who have gone up to the sky, both because they're no longer on this plane, this level with us. And so for me, I thought that was really beautiful. In one way, for me, it solved this problem I've been having with borders. I mean, there's a contradiction there. We always say we don't like borders, A lot of my work has been responding to the US-Mexico border in the Southwest. At the same time, we have land acknowledgements that say this is so-and-so's land, So that's just making more borders for me. Mm. So I don't know where to think my way through that horizontally right now. So to think vertically gave me this kind of other perspective, and starting to think about past works that I've had and newer works that I wanted to make. And so that's really where the whole kind of idea for the shows came from. In fact, at the Nord-Norsk Kunstmuseum, they don't have a rooftop terrace, too cold up there, but they do have an attic. So the exhibition there extends all the way up to the attic of that building. And at SI, there's a mural at the top on the rooftop terrace called Vertical Neighbors. So this was the piece that was performed yesterday, and it was viewable both from the street or from that terrace. And there was a pair of musicians in both areas. So a trumpet and a trombone on the roof and one on the street. Mm-hmm. And so, so next week we're going to conclude with another performance that'll be on that terrace.
It was interesting seeing Vertical Neighbors yesterday, and being able to experience it both from the roof and from the street level, because it was a 3-part performance. And it's also, I don't know whether or not this was planned, but it's interesting that this conversation is also happening today, the day of the eclipse, and where ideas of emergence and convergence are all sort of very much on all of our minds. But it's interesting to think about verticality as a way of rethinking or remapping the ways in which we encounter borders. It's another way of sort of picturing a boundary that is often taken for granted or may in some ways become invisible in the ways that these colonial constructs become so ingrained in the way that we experience these kind of physical areas. And the piece we were looking at first, Still Life, deals directly with the notion of Dene or Navajo stories of creation. So maybe we could spend a little time with this piece. And I'm also interested to hear about sort of the process of installing, and it's sort of difficult to tell in the images, but there's text on each of these plaques that are nailed to the wall, and your ability to read the text sort of varies depending on your vantage point as you move around the room, as the time of day shifts, the lighting conditions shift.
Yeah, it's a very time-based piece. I mean, it's a recording of a woman telling this creation story, telling this travel of people through the different worlds, and how animals, insects taught us to come up by climbing up through a plant vine or a stalk of corn into the next world. Or maybe there was a flood that caused us to float further up into the next world. And so she's speaking this through this array of speakers. And because of the arrangement of the speakers, and also the way that the stereo file is offset, you hear this delay of her voice, as if it's in motion across the room. And it's funny, this is the first time this is the second time. This piece is the second time it's been in New York, but somebody told me one time it sounded like as if this Navajo woman was speaking like on the subway, giving an announcement, and it was traveling through the subway platform or on the train. It's very nice to have this in this city, to think about that, some alternate universe where this would happen, where you would have, Dene Bazad being spoken over these kind of telephonic voice over these speakers. And so that idea of delay is reflected in the panels themselves. So you can see here in this photo, and as Riel was saying, depending on the time of day and the lighting, which changes over time, reflecting the not only the course of the day, but also the different worlds that are told in this story, one's able to see different parts of this text that's then reflected as a delay, as a shadow onto the wall. And so, yeah, I mean, this piece, it's somewhat different every time it gets exhibited because of the space. It's very tunable to different size of rooms and heights of rooms, and also lights. So I think this is one of the rare times where we had this big window where the sunlight was aiding in that story, and also in that kind of presentation of how the text would be read throughout the day.
But what is very specific, Raven, right, is the kind of ascending from the ground. Is it cascading? Is it going up from the ground or down from the sky? Which direction? That's
a good question. I think that's part of the question there. The ambiguity of that, it sounds like it's in motion, but I hope that it gets tuned in a way where one cannot tell which direction it's moving in. So thinking of this as a very non-linear story, as if it's folding back on itself. So it's kind of a seamless loop as she's telling this story, and it's hard to, for many people, I'm sure it's hard to tell when the story ends and when it begins, as it is on a loop in a language that most people don't know.
Maybe it would be also interesting, Raven, to mention the kind of what became almost the sister work to this in Tromsø with the sky ladder.
Yeah, do we have a slide? I don't know if we brought a slide
I don't
of
think we
that,
have an
but
image of it.
yeah, I mean, to share with you all, the splitting works between two exhibitions and, you know, being kind of half survey and half new work. I think both institutions wanted this piece, and Nordnorsk was much more of a vertical space than SI. So there was no real, you know, long rooms where I thought that this would be appropriate over at in Tromsø. So I wanted to make a new work that also spoke about this vertical relationship, this story of vertical emergence, but also as that being this, maybe this metaphor for the passing of knowledge through generations. And so that work is, I mean, it's quite long to speak about this piece, but it's influenced by an artist, a Sami artist named Ailohash, Nils Valkapa, who also is a yoiker musician, and he's no longer with us. But he had gathered these planks of wood that were on the in the fjord, and he pulled these out from the water and put them up in his home as these kinds of ready-mades. And they have these holes in these long planks of wood. And when I first saw them, I thought that he took a drill to these or found some way to bore holes into this. And to me, they looked like music. It looked like music notation, you know, a horizontal line of dots or holes. Came to find out that those holes were made by the worms. The worms had eaten through this pine. Again, this worm keeps showing up in this show, and so I was influenced by those planks of wood, and I wanted to think of those as representing a landscape. What would happen if one was to take the contour of a landscape and make that become music? That idea ended up in another piece, the work 4/4 that we'll talk about sometime the next hour, but still thinking of that line, of that image of a landscape, and what happens when multiple people who know this landscape decide to draw that. Is it the same idea? Is it the same contour? Is it the same perspective? Has the landscape changed? And maybe the landscape is only known through story and through the passing of knowledge. And so this piece, which is called the Sky Ladder, is a series of 16 planks that come down from the ceiling to the floor and curve as they are reaching the bottom of the ground. And looking at them, one sees a sequence of different perspectives of the same mountain as traced by a family. This family is the Balnango family. And so these are friends of mine, two sisters who are artists, filmmakers, Maria and Inga Balnango. And they're also involved in a lot of activism around encroachments in Sapmi territory. And so they're people that I'm happy to know, because their work reflects their concerns about where they live and their ongoing battles with those encroachments.
I want to think about this idea of or sort of the incorporation of sound and noise in your work, Raven. And Eleanor mentioned before this piece, Voiceless Mass, and there was another demonstration you did on Navajo Nation, I believe, around the Dakota pipeline, where a group of collaborators engaged in this silent protest. I suppose I'm thinking about how in this piece that you mentioned, you saw the wormholes functioning as scores, which you talk about in the catalog for the book. And how does how does your approach to the score or to notation in some ways branch from and counteract sort of Western approaches to music and to sound?
Yeah, notation for me, well, graphic notation for me was not really anything more at first than to just solve problems that Western standard notation couldn't do. So my training was as, you know, in reading music, and I was interested in studying music theory and orchestration and composing. Of course, becoming familiar with 20th century tactics, one sees, you know, all the ways to make music through a score, through graphic notation, through text scores, and other ways. You know, even not using a score, of course, is how most of the music in the world gets made. Most of it is not written down. But the more I've worked with these and developed a language, of course, one finds the opportunity for them to be have the ability to carry narrative very well and to tell story within the graphics themselves.
Maybe we could go to the slide for the first one, American Ledger number.
Oh yeah, yeah. So this is a more recent piece. I've been working with graphic scores for 20 years now, but yeah, this score is an example of a graphic composition, graphic notation composition, where it's telling the creation story of the United States. So everything from pre-colonial times through the enslavement of Black folk from Africa, the assassination of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the Industrial Revolution, and then thinking about what is next. And so these symbols, they still have this kind of hybrid Western notation meaning, but also other meanings that I've used in previous scores, or just graphics that represent an action that I couldn't think of anything that exists to do that, like lighting of a match. There's, if you see there in the lower corner, there's a note head with a flame attached to it. That just means light a match on stage in front of a microphone. Couldn't think of a better symbol for that than a flame attached to an eighth note. But there, you know, very few of these scores that I've made are, you know, the kind of graphic score I'm not a fan of is just some squiggly line say play this. You know, I think that it's important to use the opportunity that these could have dual meanings, or these could have cultural meanings. They could have meanings that people are not supposed to know about. And to me, that mystery can also be exciting to work with. So there's a space in between of allowing agency for people to improvise, but also guiding through the conversation or the process of learning the piece to create meaning as well.
When you work with collaborators, is it true that the scores can sort of they can be interpreted in different ways, and so each iteration of the project can sound different or kind of play out differently? I'm wondering if there's kind of a feedback loop there, if the way a musician interprets the score can in some ways influence the score and vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a combination of my own symbols or graphics, which have very specific meanings, but leave a lot of parameters open. So, I mean, pitch is not of any importance to me. Time is the most important parameter, but to me, it's also the most fluid. It's the most interesting. So that part of it, how fast something happens, how long something happens, is going to make all the world of difference of different interpretations. Also, what's important is just who is playing, you know, Some of these are specifically for improvisers. I have a lot of graphic scores that are for people who don't even consider themselves musicians. And so there's an opportunity there for a score to relay information about the space itself, how one moves within a room, where the sound is supposed to end up. Are you supposed to, as a musician, aim the sound in a certain way? And maybe giving options of how many times something repeats, how many, what different cells of music do you move to? I think a lot of these could be seen as paths or maps of paths that one would take, and being able to decide where the work ends up, where the composition goes. So in that sense of a form, it could end, in any number of ways, and that's all decided by the musicians themselves, either spontaneously or something that's more predetermined through rehearsal. And for me, that's really important, having these group decisions and being the facilitator, talk through those possibilities with the ensemble.
I'm wondering about, or you mentioned that certain sort of how the score essentially functions as a kind of language, and how not all languages are necessarily legible or meant to be, or sort of leave room for interpretation. I'm wondering within that and within sort of Dene epistemologies, how the idea of concealment might factor into the score, whether the possible inability to read something or to hear something, as is the case with Still Life number 3, this Dene story of creation overheard backwards and forwards through these speakers. Yeah, and to what extent is the lack of legibility a form of protection?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's always a fear that Indigenous knowledge gets misappropriated, misused, stolen and used for something else. I don't use any sacred symbols or anything like that in my pieces. I'll tell you about this graphic score I made. I did make one graphic score, kind of like Cornelius Cardew's treatise, which is these symbols I drew, and there's no rules. Like, it's just interpret this. I know I contradicting myself by saying I don't like those kind of scores, but I think every composer should make one still, And so I made these. I made a bunch of symbols, and the process of making those symbols came about from two different directions. One was these petroglyphs that are on the west side of Albuquerque, New Mexico. If anybody's been there, there's this the west side of Albuquerque that used to be a volcano, had exploded millions of years ago, and eventually the ancestors had carved into this volcanic rock all these symbols, crosses, swirls, circles, figures, arrows. And as far as I know, not many people know what those mean. I don't know what any of them mean. I've asked elders what some of those might mean, and they either didn't know or they didn't tell me. Maybe I wasn't ready to know, to have that knowledge. So I would go and draw these. I'd go at night. I'd spend the night out there on the rocks. And I had this whole sketchbook of these drawings I'd made. Some of them even from memory. Like, I didn't take the sketchbook. I went back home and drew them. An hour north of that volcano is Santa Fe, New Mexico. And probably the epicenter of commercial native art. There's a huge market there every year, the Santa Fe Indian Market. It's the epicenter of both authentic and inauthentic American Indian art. I was interested in the inauthentic, the fake stuff, and I would draw those too. a belt buckle that had some made up pictograph, and those ended up in the same sketchbook. And so I've, you know, dealing with the sketchbook, I eventually made some notations out of these and gave those to musicians to play to see what would end up in this space in between this inauthentic American Indian artwork and the ancestors' drawings that we don't know what they mean. That's the only time I've done that, you know. And so I think inside of that was a good reason to see what interpretations would emerge from any musician. I mean, it's the truth is it's very rare, absolutely rare, that any Native American musicians play this work. There's not that many of us that exist who are into this kind of thing. There's more and more through the years, which is beautiful. But yeah, it's others who play this, and it's nice to have this dialogue with them. And the first question is always, what does this mean? And I tell them, I don't know yet. We'll figure it out.
Maybe we could go a little bit later in the slideshow and look at, since we were talking about the volcano and the caldera, maybe you'd like to talk about that body of work.
That's 4-4. I think it's like 16. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a new work. This was commissioned by Swiss Institute, and it's a piece called 4-4, F-O-R-F-O-U-R. And this, I mean, a lot of these, they don't necessarily start off as scores, but they do start off as prompts, musical prompts. I think even Still Life Number 3 was like that as well. Thinking of just telling the story and seeing how that would end up as music or sound. But this piece started with that idea of singing the contour of the landscape. So again, I'm going to contradict myself. This is about pitch. Pitch is important in this piece, as that's what is going to be sung as one scans either clockwise or counterclockwise the 360 horizon line and sing that as melody. And that's not a new idea. I mean, again, that's something I think people all over the world have done. And what happens with that is it creates a very site-specific song that tells the story of that spot where that person is singing from, because they will tell the story of that mountain peak, and then it dips down into some valley and comes back around, and maybe that's the form of the song. Sami yoiking works in that way. I mean, but maybe a bit more abstract than that. Maybe not so literally going high to sing a note and going low, but thinking about the details of that landscape. What animals live on that mountain peak? Is it raining as one is looking at this landscape, or being in that valley? And what is the story of that weather?
Yeah, I think Andy Sombi in conversation with you says that the white comes from the earth. I thought that was a really lovely way to think about it. And sort of similarly, you have these 4 singers, each rotating, and each camera kind of focuses on a single person, and maybe in a way they're singing to the landscape, but also to one another, and the way their voices sound and kind of reverberate in the space also creates, I think, a unique interpretation of the site that would be subtly altered if it were not for the other 3 singers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so the prompt was, I mean, this needs a valley to happen. So the prompt was that this should take place in any valley that was caused by a sudden disruption. So this caldera is, of course, made by a volcano blowing up. If you look to the east, it's one of the channels in the video, though. Over that mountain is where the atomic bomb was developed. at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And so this was filmed in northern New Mexico. I originally wanted to try to find the place where they tested the atomic bomb, but you can't go there. It's White Sands Missile Range. They still use it as a missile range. So I wasn't going to send 4 singers over there to find that hole. But the caldera almost represents that in a way, this crater. We did the same piece over in Sapmi with the Yoikers, and that valley was caused by a dam that was put up and blocked the water of that river that runs through. And that, of course, disrupted fishing, reindeer herding, all of the Sami way of life in that area. So normally we would not be able to go into that valley to do that piece. But the way the work functions with 4 is that they are all facing different cardinal directions and begin singing that contour. And so what happens is it becomes a bit of a canon, a canonic round as they are going around, and they're kind of, again, delaying and relaying this melody. Even if it's not exact, you get the sense that it's also in motion. So this idea of things moving clockwise, counterclockwise is another kind of form that ends up in the show, in both shows. And this being reflected either as the drilling into wood planks, as the motion of windmills that are approaching in Sapmi territory, the turntable, the record player, the motion of these singers. And the score itself of Vertical Neighbors asks that the musicians move through counterclockwise and clockwise paths in concert with each other.
Yeah, a lot of your work focuses on extraction in a way that I think the 4/4 speaks to, and the field recordings similarly, I believe, also happen at sites of disruption. Is that correct?
No, those they sound like they do, but they're not. That was the first work I ever made, and that was in 1999. And the idea was just to go to actually different four places that are, I thought, to be very quiet. 2 of them on the Navajo Nation, and 1 of them in the Sandia Mountains outside of Albuquerque. And but at the same time, these are sacred places, and unfortunately not disrupted. But the idea was to go there and make a recording on a quiet day of these quiet places, and make sure there were no people around, make sure there were not even any animals or insects or wind or rain, and then go back in the studio and turn them all the way up to 11. And in that way, maybe showing, the different colors of these places, magnifying these places so that one can hear what one does not normally see or listen to when they're there. So a kind of, in a way, maybe inverse or forced deep listening, if you will, but turning that into noise. And that, that was a very early piece for me, but also very maybe something that influenced my work to this day. And that's making noise, that's building instruments, that's the timbre of just abrasive sound, maybe as a way to counter the I don't know, something like the piano, to reject the piano, which is what I learned all this music theory on as a kid.
Maybe thinking of aggressive sound, it would be a good segue to talk about Report, which was back downstairs, and also how it makes apparent the sounds or the space of the landscape in which it is that you might not otherwise notice, almost similarly to field recording.
Yeah, the three earliest pieces that I've made that I'm not embarrassed to claim, you make a lot of work when you're a kid, but these ones have remained. And so field recordings was the first one. The second one was a piece called Duet, which is also in the show as in the form of a takeaway score. So you'll find this in the stairwell, and what it is a score of rests, quarter note rests, whole note rests, half note rests, eighth note rests. But these rests also have dynamics assigned to them. So forte, piano, mezzo piano. So the idea is that there's different degrees or intensities of doing nothing, perhaps. But this is a shared experience between two people that they must align in their nothing that they're doing, the nothingness that is between them. And so I started getting excited about the possibilities of I suppose of experimental music and of inverting the things we're supposed to do, which is put dots on paper. And I had wanted to make a piece where I had no choices. And so I was looking for an instrument where I couldn't control pitch or volume or tuning. And the instrument that I thought of that would do that was firearms, was guns. And at the time I was going and shooting a lot. I was target shooting because I was hunting at the time. And so I had access to a lot of firearms. And so I wrote the score in music notation that requires 8 players to shoot different calibers of guns, and had actually found 7 other musicians who could read music and had guns, and was getting ready to do this piece. This was back in 2001, and it was all percussionists. It was all guys. It was all dudes, and it didn't look right to me. I looked at us and I said, "What am I doing? This is a dumb idea. We look like a militia or something." And so I abandoned the idea for a long time. The score had kind of spread once the internet got going, and people had seen the score and been wanting to perform it. Eventually, I did a performance of it and shot a video. And the reason I chose to do it was that I had found a more diverse group of people. Sorry, motorcycle out there. To perform this. And so the optics had changed. And I think what it did is create more questions than it answered, than being an anti-gun or pro-gun thing. I mean, it was never intended to be either. It was really to put limits on myself. And so when I did that, I found it interesting to be able to show it as moving image and seeing people represent this action. Because you wondered, are they a militia? Are they practicing for something? Are they taking land? Are they defending land? The effect of this happening too places you in a landscape. So that's one of the questions that end up is saying, well, not only what are they shooting at, but where are they? What is the history of violence in this land? And as you hear the gunshots in the piece, you hear the sonic profile of that land in its report, in the sound decaying through the landscape. And so that's going to change every time a group performs this piece. And so in a way, it's another way of amplifying the land, or of letting you deep listen in what could potentially be a situation of urgency.
Yeah, in Dylan Robinson's book, well, Dylan also writes for the catalog, but his book Hungry Listening, he writes about sort of this idea of archiving sound in these moments of disruption or migration, kind of in relation to the land. And he also builds this kind of argument about noise, going back to noise, and how settler colonial forms of perception are inherently extractivist and inherently meant to pinpoint difference or illegibility and to rule it out, which is why Western forms of music are so structured in a way. And so yeah, it's interesting with this piece. It actually does feel very structured I had to sit with it multiple times to kind of think about the score and then think about the sounds that were being made. I grew up in Missouri, which is, hunting territory as well. So, but it's, yeah, interesting how, yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about these subjectivities of sound, sort of how the bullet is not, the sound of the gunshots, they're not necessarily meant to be violent or to be to instill any kind of inherent emotion, but there's sort of different interpretations of it depending on your own experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why it ended up as a video. It was more effective to allow those optics to be part of the piece, and and I think so as it justifies it as a performance, and it's not a long piece either, but these relationships or these positions, I think, are the parameter of music that ended up being very important. Who is in the ensemble, and where are they? These two things that we maybe often ignore. We just think of the stage and that musicians are faceless or replaceable, and of course there's going to be different significance depending who that is. And maybe thinking, yeah, maybe it's not so much about the initial sound or timbre at all, and that being not a controllable factor in this piece, one then looks to the decay of the sound to tell that story, or to give that information, that through sound, of what that place is. Of course, it's conjuring the idea of violence throughout, and so that's inescapable in that piece, but I don't think it ever was meant to be dodged either.
Yeah, and sorry, I keep going back to noise because I just want to, I don't know, talk about it more, but yeah, I don't know. I'm interested in your work in particular, and seeing performances that you've done in the context of the show, as well as other earlier pieces. You did this wonderful performance with Bob Bellarue as part of New Red Order's World's Unfair. You recently did a performance with Laura Ortman as part of, I think, Public Art Fund. And yeah, the ways that noise happens within the landscape. And this sort of goes back to what you were saying earlier about the reciprocity between the sound and the landscape, and how it does create this kind of feedback loop, but also how the sound helps map the landscape itself. But I'm also interested in the idea of synchronicity or lack thereof, and maybe how that relates to these ideas of nonlinearity within the Dene epistemologies. So yeah, kind of the ways that the desynchronous becomes a useful tool for sort of, yeah, remapping linearity, if that's.
Yeah, wow, I don't know, that's a hard one.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think well, I think there's something about this that that keeps me making music. And I think it is this alignment that can happen, especially when it's multiple people. So playing in a duo, for me, that becomes very apparent. I mean, as much as I'm involved in composition, planning music, I'm also an improviser. I also, you know, I play the guitar, but I also play noise instruments. And I think for me, it's a very different practice. It's, you know, I think of the compositions, they're puzzles, if you will. They are, they, you know, whether they're a conceptual composition or they're something more narrative, or they're just music for music's sake, or they're me figuring out an instrument, they're usually some kind of thing that I'm working through. And to play music, I mean, I still want to play music, and oftentimes I don't want to have to think about playing music. I just want to play music. And to play music with your friends should not be a problem needing to be solved. And so I think that's what led me to making instruments, was that can become the puzzle for me to figure out an instrument that has no tradition, has no history. And I'm working with that to make music with another. And what that does for me too is conjure these moments of accidental alignment or music inside of that. So if me and Laura are playing and we somehow harmonize or disharmonize, it doesn't matter, you know. I mean, it's the same idea that we are lining up into this tone or this moment that we decide is music, becomes this I don't know, this thing that is outside of time for me. And that's what keeps me making, you know, being involved in just making music.
I think that raises also another really beautiful aspect of your work, which we haven't spoken about so much, which is not only the relationship it creates between the musicians and the land, but also relations between the people involved in the work, between the work and the viewer. This making of connections between people, I think, is a very important aspect of your work, and also manifests through how you are in the world, with collaborators. And you also have a lot of different projects of distributing music. You have record labels, or radio station, and so these different ways of collaborating and being in relation to one another, it's manifesting in many aspects of what you do.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I don't have as much time as I did years ago, but that's also a big part of the practice, is just allowing music to happen and facilitating that however much I can. So a big part of the hours of the day have gone to helping others make music, whether that's teaching youth on the reservation to make string quartets, or opening venues in New Mexico and running sound for some, you know, teenage metal band that wants to play, or, you know, noise people that are touring, or running a small like DIY label or radio station to share that music with other people. And so I think that's, if anything, the biggest influence to me is being involved in a community like that, and meeting those, as a touring musician, meeting those other communities around the country, and you know, seeing how they operate. People ask me all the time, what are you listening to? What records do you listen to? And I rarely have a good answer for that, because I don't listen to a lot of music, especially when I'm working, because I'm afraid I'll plagiarize something. But my answer to it, when I'm trying not to dodge it, is to say, you know, it's usually somebody's, whatever I saw last on stage, you know. And so like the End Times Festival was this last weekend here in Queens, and that's the current thing I was listening to. This kind of immediate music that you might not hear again, because it's all improvised, is the kind of thing I like to listen to. So it's never the same. It's always, and a lot of noise people change their project names every time they play. So in fact, I can't tell you who that was.
How did you get to know the performers or come to work with the performers that are in this that are sort of performing your scores for this exhibition?
Yeah, the performance we did a month ago, I've worked with all of them in different ways before. Yeah, we had Katie Porter, Bob Bellarue, Isabel Crespo, all people. Yeah, I've worked with all of them before. Bob and I have known each other for 25 years, and he's the one I tour the country with. Laura as well. We played a lot of shows together. The musicians in Report are all based in New Mexico, and they're all people I've collaborated with same amount of years for the past 25, even 30 years. Some of those same people are also in 4/4. So there's kind of a rotating cast of characters in some of these pieces as well. They're people that I have ongoing collaborative relationships with, and yeah, I end up in their work too as well. So
and then you'll have your trio perform next weekend.
Yeah, that's a group called White People Killed Them, and improvisers, Marshall Trammell, he does a project called Music Research Strategies, and he also used to be in this phenomenal band called Black Spirituals. And then John Dietrich, who's one of the guitarists of Deerhoof, which is one of my favorite bands. He's also in the group, and so I'm going to play keyboards in that, like synth. Yeah, and not much to say about it. It's one of those projects where it's music to be music, you know. But of course, it's a very provocative band name. It always gets people wondering what's going to happen. What is this, you know?
Yeah, could be anything, keep people on their toes.
Yeah.
And just because there are images of it, I wanted to go back to I think it's Still Life number 4, with the drum. It's too down. And this piece maybe I think in a way sort of relates to Vertical Neighbors, in terms of the idea of a kind of spatial mapping that plays out over sort of, in this case, more expanded geographies. But yeah, if you'd like to talk about this piece, and then we can maybe open the questions.
Yeah, how are we on time? We're good?
We're getting there.
Still Life number 4 is actually a very horizontal piece. It's the idea of it, and this is, I think, the 3rd or 4th time I've done this work, and it's always a different drum that is used. But the idea is that I request access to a drum that's being housed in a museum, and the museum does not know the last time it was hit, the drum. So the drum should be in a playable condition, but it really hasn't been played since it's been in the museum collection. And when I can, I see if there's a drum from my tribe available, so a Dene drum. And so I found that there was a Dene drum at the Smithsonian's CRC Center, Research Center, and they allowed me to go and hit the drum once, actually a few times, to record that single hit. And what happens is that drum hit gets looped into a drum beat. So just a steady beat, which whenever I do this, I try to place that tempo of that steady beat to be 180 beats per minute, which would be like a fast song, ceremonial song. And taking that position of that drum and that tempo, then having listening stations at various distances away from where that drum exists, and those tempos being slower at those listening stations. So I think at Swiss Institute, I can't remember, maybe Alison can help here.
I don't know the number off the top of my head.
A couple hundred miles away from Washington, D.C. So that tempo becomes 170-ish. And we have another listening station at arts residency on Shinnecock Reservation called Ma's House. That one is slightly further away than Swiss Institute, so that becomes 166 beats per minute. Waveform Radio is this kind of virtual listening station, but the distance of Waveform's headquarters is also about 166 beats per minute, you know, as we calculate the distance. The Navajo Nation Museum in Window Rock, Arizona, which is pretty much where the drum probably should exist, is much further. And at the calculation of that, it comes out to being about 77 beats per minute. And then we have a listening station at the Nord-Norsk Kunstmuseum, and that is so far away that it's 0.2 beats per minute. So every 5 minutes, you'll hear a boom. And so it's a bit like a metal detector. The closer you are to the drum, the faster the beating is.
And that also becomes another way of kind of expanding the relations between the people who are, who become part of the audience or become kind of interpolated by the sound.
Yeah, it's a way to allow that drum to sing continuously, but also, I think, you know, the more I've been doing this piece, it brings some accountability to those who are stewarding the drum. I used to frame the piece saying that the drum was imprisoned in these museum collections, but I've seen all instances of where there's been attempts of repatriation. There's been good stewardship. I've even seen instruments where the tribe does not want it back. It doesn't have the capacity to steward it, or it just doesn't, you know, its conditions are not going to be suitable to have it back home, let's say.
Yeah. Do you have any sort of closing thoughts on sort of, leading into this performance and on your first institutional presentation?
Just come. There's only like 5 or 6 more days left of the exhibition. If you haven't seen it yet, come. If you find yourself in Tromsø, Norway, come to that. That's open until June or July, I think. No, maybe longer. I'm not quite sure how long that one's up. And please come Sunday. It's free.
Yeah.
Like everything at Swiss Institute.
It's been so incredible to have Raven's work at SI, and the kind of, I think, multiple temporalities that the work allows and creates coexisting in this space has been really beautiful to witness. And then to also have the work featured in the catalog for the book has been incredible, because it's another kind of way that these scores can exist, another way of interacting with them. So many of Raven's works, I think, can take different forms, whether it's a score printed as a sheet of paper or as a sculptural object or performed or recorded. And then so to have them kind of collected into this monograph, which can then live in its own way, I think has been a really incredible experience. And also to think about how we translate these things into a book. So yeah, come for the last week of the show and see the book as well. Come see the book.
Yeah, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Ellen.
That was really, really brilliant. Thank you so much, Riel and Raven and Alison. Definitely go see the show, everyone. We've got just a couple questions here, and I'll turn it over to Chloe for the first question.
Yeah, I just wanted, Alison, you started answering it, but Raven, I know that, part of this exhibition is your first monograph. And I would love to hear from you directly a little bit about what Alison kind of just started to go into, which is the process of adapting or looking through all of your work for a book. I'd love to hear just a little bit more about that and about what it illuminated for you through that process.
It illuminated for me that musicians are terrible at documenting what they do, especially pre-iPhone. Yeah, there wasn't too many photos of me performing that I had access to. Yeah, instruments, I'd made instruments, they got broken on tour, they got just thrown away. Releases that I put out that I don't even own a copy anymore. It's something that I handmade. And so it was quite a task to go and find all this stuff. And it's funny enough, I was telling this story at the book launch, but some photos did exist, but they were terrible resolution. They were like one of those cheap digital cameras you saw 20 years ago. And the funny thing, I know we're all skeptical of AI, but I was able to upscale quite a few of these photos to make them usable for the book, which was amazing. And it did a great job at doing that. So some of these were salvaged because of that technology that we don't know, fully what it can do yet. Yeah, but it was great. I mean, Alison, credit Alison, and I want to shout out Santiago da Silva, who designed the book, and his studio, Cecilia Brenna. But yeah, just organizing that was quite a feat. And between my studio and Santiago's and SI and Nordnorsk, I think it's quite a dynamic book that isn't just a monograph of photos and essays, but there's a lexicon of notations. There's a script I made, out of the conversation I had with Andy, and some other things I made up, and some other kind of micro essays in there, and some symbols that link notations to some of the topics of the essays, and it bounces around quite a bit, jumps from idea to idea.
Thank you for your answer to that question. I can't wait to read the book. I'm going to pass it back over to Eleanor.
Thank you for that question, Chloe. And yeah, so excited for that book. I will ask the last question today from the Q&A. So I've been thinking during this conversation about the differences and overlaps between visual and audio work, and I think for me, audio work is so much more like spontaneous and ephemeral in a way that visual work is a little bit more maybe able to be controlled in certain ways and captured in a different way. And I'm wondering, Raven, if you can talk about how you think about those mediums and how you choose which medium to tell a certain story or to focus on in a certain work.
Yeah, I suppose it is what led me to making what's called sound art. And I think it was that almost all the works I've made have started off as some kind of idea for a composition, I think. And maybe it was never in the form of a score, but I think they were maybe all started as prompts. And oftentimes that ends up as a written composition for whatever, string quartet, wind ensemble, piano trio or something, But there were ideas that were not going to be able to be realized on stage or on a recording or even in a score. And so those ended up becoming other forms. Video, I believe, does this quite well in being able to represent these ideas that might start as sound, but they need other supplemental, handles to them, or other kinds of things to tell that story or relay that concept. But yeah, other times they need to become sculptural. I've been thinking more about scores that do not exist as pieces of paper, which has been the tradition for so long, that something else happens when the entire ensemble looks at the same score, including the audience. So this was the case of the American Ledger series. It's the case of the Vertical Neighbors piece that was premiered yesterday. And so I'm really interested in that these music for me has always been these shared experiences, even if it's just the two people performing that duet piece, that piece of silence, that's still a shared experience between those two people. And so I think the score, I'm working my way through thinking about how the score can also help make that happen, and thinking about the possibilities of just that experience even between the musicians, and maybe we experience some other kind of artifact beyond that shared experience.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Raven. Thank you so much, Alison and Brielle. And again, thank you, Raven, for this really, really generous and inspiring conversation. Definitely, again, go see the show. It's up for less than another week. And the performance on Sunday will be incredible. I'd also just like to thank Natalie and the team at Swiss Institute and Martin from Raven Studio for helping us put this event together today and for supporting the preparations. We'd also, as always, like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring the NSE and for supporting our archive, which you can view on our YouTube channel and where this conversation will be posted shortly. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years, and a donation will directly support our writers, production staff, and operations. So please consider supporting us through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for Toshiku Takaezu, Worlds Within, featuring Glenn Adamson, Kate Weiner, and Leia Lahua Lanzalotti and Christina Yang. And that's going to be an amazing conversation. So hope to see you there. And now you can turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as we leave today. And thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
So much. Have a good
Happy Eclipse Day, everyone.
evening.
Take care.
Everyone.
Right.